recognize the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Johnston, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Apologize, I'm multitasking this morning, like all of us, and I've heard bits and pieces of the answers and questions. I don't want to retread a lot of ground here, but I just do need some clarity, I think, for not only for myself, but for a lot of my constituents who may be watching these this hearing now or seeing the tapes later on. So let's boil it down to the essence of this thing. Everybody agrees that we've got a crisis on our hands in regard to empty store shelves and inflation and all the rest. The food chain supply is a big problem. I have constituents in Louisiana who are spending half of their paychecks on groceries right now. It's not a sustainable trajectory that we're on. So we all agree on the problems. The question is, what are the actual drivers of this crisis? And, my Democrat colleagues tend to blame, corporate greed. And I'm not sure that is the best analysis of what we're facing here. So I know we have differing viewpoints on this, but let me just ask Dr. St. Orange to summarize as best you can. Is it corporate greed, or what would you say, if you had to identify in layman's terms, what the biggest drivers for all of this inflation truly are?
Thank you for that. Some of it is simply rebounding from COVID. There are shortages, there are price hikes all over the world. Now, the US is far worse than Europe or Japan. So something bad is happening here. And in my opinion, that is being driven by poor policy choices. So spending, getting people not to work, regulation, particularly on labor and emissions, and union chokeholds on critical infrastructure.
When we talk about policy choices, is it specifically federal overregulation that you think of the food chain supply that is partially responsible for the inflation problem?
Yes, I think regulations in general are partially responsible. As Mr. Mann alluded earlier, in any sort of scrutiny, rules, micromanaging impositions, these tend to distort markets. They also tend to drive prices up and supply down.
Yeah, I appreciate Mr. Mann's opinion on that as well. What about vaccine mandates, this idea that we've given out billions of dollars in free money under the American Rescue Plan? I mean, are those also contributing factors to this?
In my opinion, both are. Vaccine mandates take ever more workers out of the supply chain, and of course, benefits unlinked to work also induce people to stay home.
See, our view differs. The Republican response to this is different than the Democrats. Not to make this a partisan issue, but the approach to the crisis is different. So, our Democrat colleagues want. Sorry about that. Our Democrat colleagues want to. Their reflexive response is to further grow the federal government, to give more power to the FTC and the DOJ and other agencies. And we look at that response and say, no, that is putting fuel on a fire. That makes it worse. We need to get back to the free market. So, Dr. St. Onge, how would you characterize the effect of the Biden administration's attempt specifically on the vaccine mandate? I mean, we instinctively, sort of intuitively know that that's part of the problem, but these private employers are telling us that this is imposing a real hardship. And it's fair to say farmers and meat packers and truck drivers and other workers in the food chain are adversely affected by this. Isn't that right? I mean, is that intuition that we have, is that correct?
That's absolutely right. The National Truckers Association has been really sounding the alarm. A lot of truckers do not want to get vaccinated, and we need them right now.
How specifically, I'm running out of time here, but how specifically do you think Congress could rein in inflation and improve economic circumstances for the American people? What are specific policy choices? If we were going to do the opposite, what do you think we should do in a minute?
Probably, the single biggest changes are bringing competition to the port monopolies. That would likely have a very quick impact. And then regulation really across the board against producers. Standing down on some of this scrutiny and sort of going after them, and rather actually removing regulations. President Trump did do that early in the pandemic, right? Supply chains were creaking. There was a lot of concern. He sat down with various industries and said, how can we, the federal government, proactively get out of the way? That's what could be done.
What a concept, right? Get the federal government out of the way. Reagan said, government's not the solution, government is the problem. We subscribe to that. I'm out of time, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Johnston. You're not actually out of time, so if you wanted to yield that last 16